Well, thanks again for joining me in the Word, continuing our walk through the major prophets. Really commend you for hanging in there. You know, the major prophets are called major because they're long and becomes tedious sometimes, seems to be redundant. Not the case today, though, in chapter 39 of Ezekiel, a chapter which I've called the security of God's people. You might wonder sometimes, does God really take care of me? Can he take care of me as he's promised to? And I think Ezekiel chapter 39 answers that question. This is another war, another prophecy about Gog, that Gog is going to attack again. Again, we said that Gog is the leader of a coalition. He's the ruler of a country or an area called Magog, which was mostly the Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Russia. So he is the leader of a broad coalition. I've outlined this chapter, as is my habit. I find it very useful to outline chapters in the Bible so that I could follow along and think along with the Lord as to what he's communicating to us. So my outline here is a decisive defeat in verses 1 through 8, burned and buried in verses 9 through 16, a feast in verses 17 through 20, and God glorified at the end of the chapter 21 through 29. So let's take a look at this. Notice again, this is repeated from chapter 38. I will turn you around, drive you on, take you up from the remotest parts of the north, and bring you against the mountains of Israel. So God has spoken before about turning around a coalition. In chapter 38, it was a coalition of nations north and south of Israel. In this case, it's a coalition of nations that are north. He says specifically, remotest parts of the north. Verses 3 through 6, in contrast to verse 38, this seems to be a much quicker defeat in verses 3 through 6. And then in verse 4, look at verse 4. You will fall on the mountains of Israel, you and all your troops and the peoples who are with you. I will give you as food to every kind of predatory bird and beast of the field. Kind of a gross, ignominious disposition of the bodies of this once great nation. They're going to be disposed of in a very macabre way, being eaten by animals. This is repeated about the last days, particularly the very end of the last days in Matthew 25:28, just before Jesus' judgment of Israel and the nations before the kingdom. Also, we see it in Revelation 19, verses 18 and 19, right at the end of the, seems to be the way the battle, what's known as the Battle of Armageddon, comes to a close. Verse 6, again, repeats the nations, this northern coalition now of Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, known in biblical times as Magog. In verse 7, God tells us his purpose in the defeat is to reveal himself, both to the nations and to Israel. We've talked about this before, that God is in the business of making himself known. He's not hiding, but he's making himself known. Behold, it's coming, it says in verse 8. It shall be done. This is the days of which I have spoken. Again, God giving us the assurance that what he has promised will come to pass. And we know from other prophecies that are fulfilled that they're going to come to pass in a very literal way. 9 through 16 then is the next section of this chapter, burned and buried. The weapons of the invaders are going to be burned, their wealth confiscated. So you see the picture here in verse 38. They came, invaded Israel, wanting to take Israel's wealth. Here the tables turned. As God does that, his talionic judgment, that appropriate, proportional judgment, the invaders' wealth will be taken in verses 9 through 10. Verses 11 through 12 talk about Gog and his forces will be buried. So the remains, what the birds and animals leave behind, are going to be buried over a period of 7 months. And the burial ground is that area we discussed before, Haman Gog. It's called here literally the multitude of Gog. It's going to be so named because so many of Gog's victims, the victims of war, will be buried there. So verses 9 through 16, burned and buried. Verses 17 through 20 then talk about this kind of macabre feast. These birds and beasts are going to consume what's left. Verse 18, notice the contrast here. Mighty men and princes are going to suffer what in an ancient Near Eastern context is a really nearly an ultimate sort of humiliation, in that they don't receive the respectful burial that they were perhaps expecting, but rather they're eaten by animals. As you look at this too, I'd invite you to think about again the turnabout that's happened here, the reversal that God seems to make so often. It says birds and animals now used to be under the Mosaic covenant were sacrificed to God. Now instead, God provides a sacrifice of his enemies to the birds and to the animals themselves. We drop down then to verse 21, and we see God glorified here. God's glorified through his judgment of the nations and his judgment on Israel. His holiness, his righteousness is going to be plain to all people. I've pointed out several times this kind of fancy word, talionic judgment, that God's wrath poured out, his chastisement on the nation is not arbitrary, but it's proportional to their sin. So that's going to show God to be holy and righteous in his judgment. Verse 25, we see the restoration of Jacob, that is Israel, mercy on the whole house of Israel. Again, evidence here that God is ready, willing, able, and will restore Israel, much less believers in the church today, that he could do that for you, brothers and sisters. Verse 26, the security that he's talking about here, security in their own land with none to make them afraid. This is a reference to the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7. Also in verse 28, he says, I made them go into exile and then gathered them again to their own land. And I will leave none of them there, that is in these foreign lands, any longer. That's a fulfillment of the land covenant from Deuteronomy 30. And in verse 29, pouring out my spirit on the house of Israel is a fulfillment of the new covenant in Jeremiah 31:31. I hope you're remembering, I've mentioned this several times, that God is keeping these covenants with his people. This is how he shows himself to be a faithful God that can be trusted. So, what do we learn from this? Well, we see God revealing himself here. We could say it's kind of an odd rule in the kingdom of God that when we try to exalt ourselves, we just get smaller by the moment. When we try to lift ourselves up, we get pushed down. God's jealous of his glory. We see that here. And he's not going to share it with anyone. He is going to work in Israel in such a way that he is going to be clearly revealed among his people and among the nations. So God is going to do that. When we get in the way of that, God's going to put us aside. So our job, brothers and sisters, during this church age is to make much of God. Tell people about his greatness in the past, his greatness in the present, in the salvation of Jews and Gentiles alike, and his salvation in the future when he revisits the land that he promised to redeem and restore. Which brings us to the second application. is God has pledged himself to make Israel a great nation. He's pledged himself to restore them securely in the land, provide them with the eternal king, and to regenerate their hearts. Other prophecies in the Bible are literally fulfilled. Why not this one? And of course, it will be. God bless you, brothers and sisters. God bless you in your study of Ezekiel and the major prophets. May God richly bless you for all the time and effort that you put into this, the discipline that you bring to bear in reading these chapters. God bless you.